Okay. Hello. Welcome. It's the 12th of March, I think. Dis and dat information. Yesterday, we looked at a variety of things, um, but we've been looking at things like E.F. Schumacher, among others, thinking about how to construct, in some ways, ecosocialism, one that is just a part of rethinking issues like, for example, the definition of what counts as quote unquote natural capital. And I think you could see that in Schumacher's writing. But we can also see this, of course, in other areas like Bellamy Foster et al. The idea that we're looking for where certain things overlap, where things might coincide. Um, where the circuits meet, as it were, the cycles meet. Um, and in fact, that's the precise problem. By the time we get to volume two of Capital, for example, what is it about circuits of capital that, uh, regardless of the type, that are important? And so I've been looking at different ways in which we could talk about not only the lexicon of terms, the way in which we talk about some of these things and characterize them, and not worry so much about whether it's neologisms, that is, new terms, or the issue of old wine, new bottles. The idea that some older terms are still okay. So today we'll talk a little bit about um, things like externalities. I'm going to introduce or reintroduce some things from the 19th century, things that actually interested me when I was in college, an undergraduate, but probably not enough, I guess. Probably because I didn't do enough reading or I was too busy hoarding books rather than opening them up or something. Anyway, so I start today with a quote from David Graeber, the late David Graeber, but we're going to go through kind of Herman Daly, and wind up with Noam Chomsky at the end, sort of. Um, I included a video that is by Paul Kochstadt on an idea that is not problematic, or well, it's problematic if you haven't sort of thought about it enough. Let's put it that way, is to describe a kind of historical materialism that is, in fact, uh, like a Markov model, Markov, which shows that Paul um, combines a lot of things and asks some interesting questions, and by the end, you sort of go, "Well, that makes sort of sense." But it is a complicated set of ideas, and I don't want to start with that because that will just get us lost. What we need to do is work through some of the basic terms, and we might wind up with Paul's viewpoint. On the other hand, we might just remain with what begins this idea, and I mentioned it yesterday, the illth idea or the ilth idea of the opposition to wealth. I mean, if the model of civilization is of a kind of capital accumulation that is to produce or form wealth, in many ways, the difference that one can make between humans and animals is that our accumulations are not necessarily like storing fat for the winter, although they seem like that sometimes. Rather, it's a little bit more about what we do with it, more of what we do with it rather than simply store it and sort of consume it slowly, um, even though that's what we do as well. So, anyway, the quote from Graeber talks a little bit about, it's now clear that this ideological hegemony, that is 30 years of, you know, yammering, denialism, all this other ideological conflict, is incredibly problematic. It produces itself, it reproduces itself within the context of neoliberalism because, on the one hand, that's all they have. On the other hand, it isn't. It just clearly isn't. It's never been that way. But enforcing ignorance is the current trend, as it were, a reactionary trend to enforce a reaction to a modern world. Um, or to fetishize certain elements of a modern world without thinking about how it fits in the larger historical scheme of things. So, anyway, it's quite clear that this ideological hegemony has now reached its limit. Does this mean the system is on the point of collapse? It's hard to say, but capitalism is not old. It hasn't been around forever, and it seems just as reasonable to imagine it can be transformed into something completely different as to imagine it will necessarily continue existing until the sun blows up or until it annihilates us through some ecological catastrophe. So, this is that challenge that we can't imagine a better future. Now, the late Pastone, um, according to Marx's critical theory, the abolition of the accelerating blind process of economic growth and socio-economic transformation in capitalism, as well as its crisis-ridden character, would require the abolition of value. Overcoming these alienated forms would necessarily involve establishing a society based on material wealth in which increased productivity would result in a corresponding increase in social wealth. Such a society could be characterized by a form of growth very different from capitalist growth. Marx's distinction between material wealth and value allows for an approach that relativizes the opposition between runaway growth as a condition of social wealth on the one hand, and austerity as a condition for the ecologically sound organization of production and distribution on the other. By locating this opposition in a historically specific form of social life, if his analysis of value as the determining form of wealth and of social mediation in capitalist society is valid, then it points to the possibility that this opposition can be overcome. So, suggesting it slightly in different terms, but pretty much the same thing that David Graeber was talking about. Now, the argument has been presented by a variety of folks and of course, treated in terms of activism differently. For example, the Extinction Rebellion folks, have a very clear activist message about, accelerating and it is an accelerationist movement, the conflicts so that people can see the clear contrast of what the difference between a world growing out of control um, and one that might grow in control, one that might be have a certain idea about degrowth without negating the idea of growing. And there's a difference, as I talked about yesterday, the idea of steady state economies, that they're dynamic economies, they have equilibria, but they're not wholly driven by the need to have certain, as it were, profit rates, growth rates, certain rates do not sort of dominate the discussion. Now, amidst all that, we have the general sort of theoretical problems underlying this that Marx and Marxists don't fully either disengage or engage the problem of average prices, average certain types of averages, and it's really not about the average. It's really about you know it is more about directions or trends or vectors or however you want to call it, and so it is in the dynamics of the system that's actually more important. So yesterday we came across ILF, coined by Ruskin in the 1860s. the reverse of wealth in the sense of ill being the opposite of well. So, it is this idea of if there are goods, there could be bads. Yes and no. But it's sort of an interesting notion and certainly framed by a lot of people, up to and including Herman Daly, who is very important in the idea of thinking about steady state. So yesterday I talked about, I introduced this section from Unto This Last by John Ruskin. But for we ought to have a correspondent term as ilth, causing various devastation and trouble around them in all directions, or lastly, act not at all, but are merely animated conditions of delay, no use being possible of anything they have until they are dead, in which last condition they are nevertheless often useful as delays and impedimenta, if a nation is apt to move too fast. One can argue that the current state of mass cruelty or mass disruption is of that ilth, as they say. Anyway, it is an anachronistic term, I suppose, from the 19th century, but I think it still comes up here and there, and Herman Daly, in advocating for a steady state economy, can be seen to doing that. So here's one article by Herman Daly: Wealth, Ilth, and Net Welfare. Well-being should be counted in net terms. That is to say, we should consider not only the accumulated stock of wealth, but that of ilth, and not only the annual flow of goods, but also that of bads as opposed to goods. The fact that we have to stretch English usage to find words like ilth and bads with which to name the negative consequences of production. We'll see later on that this negative consequences are important, particularly important in the idea of, well, that neoclassical economics has tended to prefer discussions that some things are internal and some things are external. And the negative stuff, you're not supposed to pay attention to, but in fact, it always is there. And often it is more important. So, the negative consequences of production that should be subtracted from the positive consequences is indicative of our having ignored the realities for which these words were the necessary names. Bads and ilth consist of things like nuclear waste, the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. The dead zone itself might be the America part of the Gulf of America. But anyway, the biodiversity loss, climate change from excess carbon in the atmosphere, depleted mines, eroded topsoil, dry wells, exhausting and dangerous labor congestion, etc. We're indebted to John Ruskin for the word ilth and to an anonymous economist, perhaps Kenneth Boulding, for the word bads. In the empty world of the past, these concepts and the names for them were not needed because the economy was so small relative to the containing natural world that our production did not incur any significant opportunity cost of displaced nature. However, we now live in a full world, full of us and our staff, and such costs must be counted and netted out against the benefits of growth. Otherwise, we might end up, remember he's writing in 2011, we might end up with extra bads outweighing extra goods and increases in ilth greater than the increases in wealth. What used to be economic growth could now become uneconomic growth. That is, growth in production for which marginal costs are greater than marginal benefits. Growth that in reality makes us poorer, not richer. Kind of where we are now. No one is against being richer. The question is, does growth any longer really make us richer, or has it started to make us poorer? Ilth and bads are words that we've stretched our English usage in order to name such negative consequences of production. He suspects that it's now making us poorer, at least in some high GDP countries, and we've not recognized it. Indeed, how could we, when our national accounting measures only economic activity? Activity is not separated into costs and benefits. Everything is added in GDP. Nothing is subtracted. The reason that bads and ilth, inevitable joint products with goods and wealth, are not counted, even when they're when no longer negligible in the full world, is that obviously no one wants to buy them. So there's no market for them and hence no price by which to value them. But it's worse. These bads are real, and people are very willing to buy the anti-bads that protect them from the bads. For example, pollution is an unpriced, uncounted bad, but pollution cleanup is an anti-bad that is accounted for as a good. Now, let me break there for a second and note, of course, carbon credits are that kind of problem, the trade and pollution credits. Pollution cleanup has a price, and we willingly pay it up to a point and add it to GDP, but without having subtracted the negative value of the pollution itself that made the cleanup necessary. Such asymmetric accounting hides more than it reveals. In addition to asymmetric accounting of anti-bads, we count natural capital depletion. Remember, this is the same natural capital we were talking about yesterday, as if it were income, further misleading ourselves. If we cut down all the trees this year, catch all the fish, burn all the oil and coal, etc., then GDP counts all that as this year's income. But true income is defined as the maximum that a community can consume this year and still produce and consume the same amount next year. That is maximum production while maintaining the intact future capacity to produce, that is capital, that's capital in the broadest sense. Nor is it only depletion of natural capital that is falsely counted as income. Failure to maintain and replace depreciation of man-made capital, such as roads and bridges, has the same effect. Much of what we count in GDP is capital consumption and anti-bads. Now, you can see this growing image here depicts the accretion of GDP in the USA. Such growth, however, is not measured correctly because it only consists of capital consumption and the anti-bads. As argued above, one reason that growth may be uneconomic is that we discover that its neglected costs are greater than we thought. Another reason is that we discover that the extra benefits of growth are less than what we thought. This second reason has been emphasized in the studies of self-evaluated happiness, which show that beyond a threshold annual income of some 20 to 25,000, further growth does not really increase happiness. Happiness beyond this threshold is overwhelmingly a function of the quality of our relationships in the community, by which our very identity is constituted, rather than the number of goods consumed. A relative increase in one's income still yields extra individual happiness, but aggregate growth is powerless to increase everyone's relative income. Growth in pursuit of relative income is like an arms race in which one party's advance cancels that of the other. It is like everyone standing and craning his neck in a football stadium while having no better view than if everyone had remained comfortably seated. Isn't that how we often think? As aggregate growth beyond sufficiency loses its power to increase welfare, it increases its power to produce ilth. This is because to maintain the same rate of growth, ever more matter and energy has to be mined and processed through the economy, resulting in more depletion, more waste, and requiring the use of ever more powerful and violent technologies to mine the ever leaner and less accessible deposits. Petroleum from an easily accessible well in East Texas costs less labor and capital to extract and therefore adds less to GDP than petroleum from an inaccessible well a mile under the Gulf of Mexico, America. The extra labor and capital spent to extract a barrel in the Gulf of Mexico are not a good or addition to wealth. It is more like an anti-bad made necessary by a bad of depletion, the loss of a natural subsidy to the economy. In a full employment economy, the extra labor and capital going to petroleum extraction would be taken from other sectors. So aggregate real GDP would likely fall, but the petroleum sector would increase its contribution to GDP as nature's subsidy to it diminished. We would be tempted to regard it as more rather than less productive. So the next time some economist or politician tells you we must do everything we can to grow in order to fight poverty, win wars, colonize space, cure cancer, whatever, Remind him that when something grows, it gets bigger. Ask him how he thinks the economy is now relative to the ecosphere and how big he thinks it should be. And what makes him think that growth is still causing wealth to increase faster than ilth? And how does he know that we've not already entered an era of uneconomic growth? And if we have, then is not the solution to poverty to be found in sharing now rather than in the empty promise of growth in the future? If you get a reasoned, coherent answer, please send it to me. So, what Daly is trying to do, of course, is rethink the notion of what counts as a social contract. What is it that we're accountable for in the world, because we only have one of them? Now, of course, the argument gets a little distorted, noting, of course, that yes, Trump signed an executive order to fast track logging on federal land. Logging on federal land has always existed. It's just the idea is that they want to speed it up, and other things are possible, but are not yet. It's not yet as awful as it could be, even though that's the kind of front end rhetoric about it. The order allows federal agencies to bypass the environmental protection laws in an effort to increase production, but doesn't call for clear cutting. So, it's another dominoes thing. If you speed up all this stuff, eventually clear cutting will occur. And in fact, clear cutting occurs because of property rights and other relations. But anyway, while the claim was exaggerated, it was based in truth. The executive order was real, and it did greatly impact logging rights on federal land. However, it did not explicitly call for the clear cutting of 280 million acres of trees. As such, we rate the claim, this is Snopes, we rate the claim a mixture of true and false, which gets us perhaps nowhere. The U.S. Forest Service manages 193 million acres of land across the country, while the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, manages just under 58 million acres of forest and woodlands, according to their websites. Unlike national parks, national forests, and BLM forests, national forests and BLM forests allow for logging and resource exploitation, as well as wildlife conservation and recreation. Now, Trump's executive order specifically asks those agencies to investigate and implement ways this is government bureaucratic language, implement ways to increase both the speed and quantity of timber produced by cutting environmental relations. Now, all that, of course, in not so much response, but parallel to the imposition of tariffs on one of the countries from which we get a heck of a lot of lumber and timber, and that is Canada. So you can see that this is much more complicated. So I wanted to talk a little bit about externalities because that is what, ILF somewhat talks about. Externalities in economics refer to costs or benefits that affect third parties who are not directly involved in a transaction. They can be negative, like pollution from a factory, or positive, such as the benefits of education that improve community productivity. Note, of course, that these are externalities, and in some ways they're being ignored. So if you kill off the Federal Department of Education, it might not seem that anything is being truly affected, but in fact there are. An externality is a cost or benefit that is caused by one party, but financially incurred or received by another. Externalities can be negative or positive. A negative externality is the indirect imposition of a cost by one party onto another. A positive externality, on the other hand, is when one party receives an indirect benefit as a result of actions taken by another. So you can say that because externalities can be both negative and positive, we can see that a marginal solution, on the one hand, you can make people stupider, but on the other hand, you benefit people who are already smarter. So you can see that it's an interesting kind of trade-off. It's kind of a barrier to entry in a whole nother way of thinking. Anyway, externalities can stem from either the production or consumption of a good or service. The costs and benefits can be both private to an individual or an organization, or social, meaning that it can affect society as a whole. An externality is an event that occurs as a byproduct of another event occurring. An externality can be good or bad, often noted as a positive externality or a negative externality. An externality can also be generated when something is made, that is, a production externality, or used, a consumption externality. Consumption externalities, aluminum cans, for example. Pollution caused by commuting to work or a chemical spill caused by improperly stored wastes are examples of externalities. Governments and companies can rectify externalities by financial and social measures. And you can see that that leads us into a whole bunch of other potential problematic examples, which I hope you can think about. So, to follow further on, this is a very basic article and not very long, um, but written by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Consumption, production, and investment decisions of individuals, households, and firms often affect people not directly involved in the transactions. Sometimes these indirect effects are tiny. But when they're large, they can become problematic, what economists call externalities. Externalities are among the main reasons governments intervene in the economic sphere. Most externalities fall into the category of so-called technical externalities, that is, the indirect effects have an impact on the consumption and production opportunities of others, but the price of the product does not take those externalities into account. As a result, there are differences between private returns or costs and the returns or costs to a society as a whole. Negative and positive externalities. In the case of pollution, the traditional example of a negative externality, a polluter makes decisions based only on the direct cost of and profit opportunity from production and does not consider the indirect cost to those harmed by the pollution. The indirect costs include decreased quality of life, say in the case of a homeowner near a smokestack, higher healthcare costs, and foregone production opportunities. For example, when pollution harms activities such as tourism, since the indirect costs are not borne by the producer and therefore not passed on to the end user of the goods produced by the polluter, the social or total costs of production are larger than the private costs. This is also referred to as cost shifting, and there's plenty of cost shifting going on. And the current kerfuffle in the federal government is part of this cost shifting. There are also positive externalities, and here the issue is the difference between private and social gains. For example, research and development, R&D, activities are widely considered to have positive effects beyond those enjoyed by the producer that funded the R&D, normally the company that pays for the research. This is because R&D adds to the general body of knowledge, which contributes to other discoveries and developments. Now, however, the private returns of a firm selling products based on its own R&D typically do not include the returns of others who benefited indirectly. With positive externalities, private returns are smaller than social returns. Hence the, attacks on the NIH, etc. When there are differences between private and social costs or private and social returns, the main problem is that market outcomes may not be efficient. To promote the well-being of all members of society, social returns should be maximized and social costs minimized. This implies that all costs and benefits need to be internalized by households and firms making buying and production decisions. Otherwise, market outcomes involve underproduction of goods and services that entail positive externalities or overproduction in the case of negative externalities. Overproduction or underproduction reflects less than optimal market outcomes in terms of society's overall condition, what economists call the welfare perspective. It has nothing to do with welfare queens, blah, blah, blah. This is just simply gains and, overall, benefits that, you're the goods, as they say, or the anti-bads. Consider again the example of pollution. Social costs grow with the level of pollution, which increases in tandem with production levels. So goods with negative externalities are overproduced when only private costs are considered in decisions and not costs incurred by others. To minimize social costs would lead to lower production levels. Similarly, from a societal perspective, maximization of private rather than social returns leads to underproduction of the good or service with positive externalities. Now, the section on taxation and externalities. Neoclassical economists long ago recognized that the inefficiencies associated with technical externalities constitute a form of market failure. Private market-based decision-making fails to yield efficient outcomes from a general welfare perspective. These economists recommended government intervention to correct for the effects of externalities. In the Economics of Welfare, British economist Arthur Pigou suggested that governments tax polluters an amount equivalent to the cost of the harm to others. You can see how problematic that can be to estimate. Such a tax would yield the market outcome that would have prevailed with adequate internalization of all costs by polluters. By the same logic, governments should subsidize those who generate positive externalities in the amount that others benefit. Now, the proposition that technical externalities require government regulation and taxation to prevent less than optimal market outcomes was intensely debated after Pigou's seminal work. Some economists argued that market mechanisms can correct for the externalities and provide for efficient outcomes. People can resolve the problems through mutually beneficial transactions. For example, a landlord and a polluter could enter into a contract in which the landlord agrees to pay the polluter a certain amount of money in exchange for a specific reduction in the amount of pollution. Such contractual bargaining can be mutually beneficial. Now, once the building is less exposed, if we're talking about a building here with a landlord, once the building is less exposed to pollution, the landlord can raise rents. So that's cost shifting, right? As long as the increase in rents is greater than the payment to the polluter, the outcome is beneficial for the landlord. Similarly, as long as the payment exceeds the loss in profit from lower pollution, lower production, the polluter is better off as well. So you can see there's a marginal solution that can occur in this particular context, but often doesn't because people, are free riders or they're price gougers or whatever. The possibility of overcoming the inefficiencies from externalities through bargaining among affected parties was first discussed by Ronald Coase, 1960. And yes, there's a tremendous literature on this. And yes, he got himself a Nobel Prize in 1991, noting, of course, that it takes 31 years in this context. For bargaining solutions to be feasible, property rights must be well defined. Bargaining transaction costs must be low, and there must be no uncertainty or asymmetric information when one side knows more than the other about the transaction. And this is a big problem, and of course comes up in literature about, for example, asymmetric information in selling you a car. Needless to say, that's at work currently with Trump touting electric cars when, in fact, 2 years ago he said nobody wants electric cars. Against this backdrop, optimal government intervention might be the establishment of institutional frameworks that allow for proper bargaining among parties involved in externalities. Property rights, specifically intellectual property rights, such as patents, allow a firm to earn most, if not all, the returns from its research and development. But it is easier to assign property rights for innovations and inventions than for basic or general research. This is always a problem. Property rights for such research are more difficult to define, and government subsidies typically are needed to ensure a sufficient amount of basic research. And yes, that's a continuous discussion. Investing in basic research doesn't seem to generate enough intellectual property, yet they form the basis or foundation for many things that ultimately do pay off, as it were. Public goods. Problems in defining property rights are often a fundamental obstacle to market-based self-correcting solutions because the indirect effects of production or consumption activity can affect so-called public goods, which are a special kind of externality. Now, these goods are both non-excludable, that is, whoever produces or maintains the public good, even at a cost, cannot prevent other people from enjoying its benefits, and the other thing, besides being non-excludable, are non-rival. That is, consumption by one individual does not reduce the opportunity for others to consume it. So this is a a nuance, as it were. If the private benefits are small relative to the social benefit, but private costs to provide them are large, public goods may not be supplied at all. The importance of the public good problem has long been recognized in the field of public finance. That is, taxes often finance government's delivery of public goods, such as, for example, law and order, and hence the defunding the police. The public good problem is especially notable in environmental economics, which largely deals with analyzing and finding solutions to externality related issues. Clean air, clean water, biodiversity, and a sustainable stock of fish in the open sea are largely non rival and non excludable goods. So you can yammer, as Trump does, about clean air and clean water and not have to do anything. They are free goods produced by nature and available to everybody. They are subject to no well defined property rights. As a result, households and firms do not place enough value on these public goods, and efficient market outcomes through bargaining typically are not feasible. In other words, environmental issues often face a collective action problem. High transaction costs and problems related to uncertainty or other obstacles which prevent parties involved in technical externalities from internalizing costs and benefits through bargaining solutions. Uncertainty problems are far reaching. In fact, the well known moral hazard is a form of externality in which decision makers maximize their benefits while inflicting damage on others, but do not bear the consequences because, for example, there's uncertainty or incomplete information about who's responsible for the damages or contract restrictions. For example, an insured entity can affect its insurance company's liabilities, but the insurance company is not in a position to determine whether the insured is responsible for an event that triggers a payout. Similarly, if a polluter's promised preventative actions cannot be verified because of a lack of information, bargaining is unlikely to be a feasible solution. And note that we currently have a central government that builds all of its efforts on lack of information. Today, the most pressing and complex externality problem is greenhouse gas emissions, GHG. The atmospheric accumulation of greenhouse gases from human activity has been identified as a major cause of global warming. Barring policies to curb GHG emissions, scientists expect this problem to grow and eventually lead to climate change and its accompanying costs, including damage to economic activity from the destruction of capital, for example, along coastal areas, and lower agricultural productivity. Externalities come into play because the costs and risks from climate change are borne by the world at large, whereas there are few mechanisms to compel those who benefit from greenhouse gas emitting activity to internalize those costs and risks. The atmosphere, in fact, is a global public good with benefits that accrue to all, making private bargaining solutions unfeasible. Identifying and agreeing on policies for internalization of the social costs of GHG emissions at the global level are extremely difficult, given the cost to some individuals and firms and difficulties of global enforcement of some such policies, electric vehicles. Externalities pose fundamental economic policy problems when individuals, households, and firms do not internalize the indirect costs of or the benefits from their economic transactions. The resulting wedges between social and private costs or returns lead to inefficient market outcomes. In some circumstances, they may prevent markets from emerging. Now, although there's room for market-based corrective solutions, government intervention is often required to ensure that benefits and costs are fully internalized. Now, this is the continuing argument that we raise relative to Musk being supported, significantly by public funds. And no one ever asks him that in a press conference, which I always find interesting. Anyway, now, the other articles that I've included are one that you can find us. Actually, the full book is available online, which I am grateful for. It's a strange little book on tragedy of labor, the tragedy of the worker, done by a collective, the Salvage Collective. They have an interesting little website of their own. And this little book is it's a short book. It's I think worth reading if you can stand sort of the philosophic direction or nature of the writing. So I'm only going to read a small fragment from this because I think it's important that we appreciate the kind of underlying political and philosophical issues. And for me, I learned a little bit more because I haven't done as much reading as I'd like to on the issue of Soviet ecology. Let's put it that way. So let me read from some of this because I'm getting to the end of my usual yammering. Um, let's see. There's a big section in here which is really useful on capital, but let me read from the section more specifically on, as it were, so-called red ecology. Aside from leading off with the nice provocative term phrase, what the bourgeoisie produces above all are its own gravediggers from the manifesto. The tragedy of the worker is that as long as she works for capitalism, she must be her own gravedigger. Capitalism never extracts energy from the earth, but makes it a taxing withdrawal from the worker's body. Needless to say, you can see the labor theory of value at work. If the entire problem facing humanity was how to source a fixed quantity of energy without destroying the planet, the problem might have been solved by now. For example, solar energy could in principle meet our needs many times over, yet energy as such, like value, is an abstraction. No physicist is able to say what it is. It is not, as Vaclav Smil writes, and as I've mentioned this guy Smil before, he writes about the integration of energy and matter. It's a useful materialist approach. A single easily identifiable entity, calories, biomass, electromagnetism, light waves, heat, and motion all have the property of being energy. And for human societies, it matters greatly what sort of energy is available. Energy not being edible. The sun, indeed, is already our main source of energy. As Vernadsky put it, the biosphere is at least as much a creation of the sun as a result of terrestrial processes. What we consume as caloric energy has been captured by photosynthesis. That depends on life processes whose degradation through overfishing, deforestation, and intensive agriculture would not be remedied by techno-fix, even if capturing high entropy solar radiation were simple and adaptable enough to power such crucial industries as aviation. It is, to repeat, a signal error to think that the ideological secretions of fossil capital, this is introduced earlier in the text, begin and end with the climate denialist industry, currently abandoned even by the majority of fossil capitalists. Rather, ideology is sedimented into its scientific knowledge. Capital must, of course, attend to physical realities in a way that the Heritage Foundation need not. However, it tends to read these realities through its own screen of commodity production. Knowledge of energy as an abstract entity subject to laws of conversion, conservation, and quantification is one such secretion. As Thomas Kuhn argued, it is no coincidence that the major contributions to energy science from Carnot, Kelvin, Helmholtz, and Clausius emerged just as industry was converting energy from wind, wood, water, and coal. It was the steam engine that sparked interest not so much in the nature of heat, Ilya Progione and Isabel Stengers point out, as in heat's possibilities for producing mechanical energy. If thermodynamics, whose discovery was born of this interest, treated energy as though it were indestructible and substitutable, this was exactly how fossil capital treated it. The Industrial Revolution was also the moment, as Anson Rampenbach has shown, when the Enlightenment begot productivist view of human energy and its deployment was consolidated. Work became linked not to Christian dignity nor to medieval artisanship, but to flows of energy deemed to be limitless in principle, that is, labor power. So this is that. Remember, I've talked about labor power being an abstraction and a kind of expectation, as it were, potentiality. Capital's inexhaustible demand for exhaustible energy entails a distinctive form of what Dominic Boyer terms uh, ener- energopolitics. Uh, Capital isn't hungry for energy in the way that a machine or a living body is. It grows in the value added to that energy by human labor. It doesn't just rip open stocks of purified carbon deposited by ancient life with utter disregard for the externalities. Its relationship to non human energy is structured by its dependence on human energy, its extraction of fossil fuel, a byproduct of its extraction of caloric energy, purchased as labor power and converted into economic value. The role of non human energy in the production process might best be captured by Marx's term dead labor. Dead labor is infrastructure, where an infrastructure is whatever allows new work to take place. It's the mixing of human caloric energy extracted from the laboring body with fossil energy and resources to produce stockpiles, machinery, buildings, railways, the grid, all to intensify the work of living labor. So, in this, explanation is the labor theory of value as a theory, actually, of our apocalypse. Energy by itself, although abundant in the natural world, does not produce economic value. An aggregate expansion in the use of energy both enables and, from the point of view of capital, requires an aggregate expansion of the labor force. From that point of view, whatever its impact on particular groups of workers, fears of automation destroying work to core are misplaced as long as capitalism is around. This is kind of where we're getting to in volume 1 of Capital. The capitalist work energy regime, as George Kafensis and Jason W. Moore dub it, entails a relentless raid on human energy in a production process whose product is extinction. The only ultimate limits to this process are revolt and or physical exhaustion. Resistance to fossil capital is class self-defense. The tragedy of the worker is that the workers' movement has only episodically been able to embrace this understanding. The workers' hopes have been tied to the energetic foundations of capitalism and its apparent proffer of liberation from back-breaking labor. Scant years ago, the hopes of much of the left were pinned to the stability of pink-eyed regimes in Latin America, such as Venezuela, dependent on the resource base of extractivism, that is, oil in Venezuela. Crucial left debates about these regime strategies bracketed immediate questions of political survival thereof, and the amelioration of working class conditions therein were urgent. And in that context, the resources of the extractive industries irresistible, even for many quite clear-eyed about the ecological ramifications. See Brazil. This is a tragedy of the worker. It does not imply that no alternatives at all could have been developed, but it abjures moralism and acknowledges the constraint of space for maneuver. So anyway, this is a discussion of work questions. Further on, it goes on to describe the problems of these horizons are not only formed by the immediate context of weakness and failure. The specter of a much larger defeat haunts the worker. Here, the left must register its own illusions, its own hubris, its own defeats. And then the next section, which I think is really interesting, is about the necessity within the Soviet Union to rationalize, working to base the economy on fossil capital, essentially, and with aside from all the usual communist infighting, winds up with the same kind of thing. So it is a discussion of, how in terms of modernizing the Soviet economy, it was necessary to, accept the need to develop capital on you could call it a capitalist model. You can refer to it, as some do, not everyone, some do, as state capitalism. From that point on, the Russian state was a fossil state dedicated to competing with Western economies in conditions of autarky. It required breakneck industrialization. That, in turn, required the most efficient and relentless exploitation of the natural resources and labor forces available to a vast overland empire. From the 1960s to the 1980s, against the resistance of Sami locals, the Arctic Ocean was used as a nuclear dump. This is a long-standing story. In 1990, 40% of Soviet people lived in areas of 3 to 4 times higher air pollution than was supposedly permissible, and half of all wastewater in the capital went untreated. Nothing, of course, was solved by the transition to the most feral iteration of free market capitalism. By 1996, 50% of Russian water was polluted. In 2010, 200 cities in Russia exceeded their own air pollution limits. A 2018 Russian Environmental Ministry document reports a 11-fold increase in deaths due to environmental disasters between 2016 and 2017, and temperatures increasing at more than double the average global rate. Russia remains the fourth highest greenhouse gas emitting country in the world. So to end this little yammering here, the metabolic rift, to use John Bellamy Foster's term for Marx's notion of the irreparable rift in the interdependent process of social metabolism, that cosmal source of ecological crisis was to Soviet planners a growth strategy. And, it's sad to see that, but it is very true that that's kind of what they had to do. You do what you have to do. So it's an interesting little paper because it does raise some of these other questions that are raised elsewhere. But I think you need to sort of think about this in the overall history of it. And then I close with it's a little piece done, Noam Chomsky with Bob Poland, and a little joint piece, I think, because of Chomsky's advanced age, among other things. But he mentions in this, and I think, well, I'm going to snag a copy of this and maybe we'll read through it, or at least I'll read through it, because it just says the entire problem of the United States economy. And it's, this is Cokeland, The Secret History of Coke Industries and Corporate Power in America. It's a 2019 book by Christopher Leonard. And it does indulge the kind of singular vision that that is oppressing America. So it is this the things that need to be done. Greenhouse gas emission restrictions need to be at least achieve the main target set in 2018 by the IPCC, namely near zero emissions by 2050. This requires the phase out of fossil fuels as an energy source by 2050, as well as the replacement of corporate agricultural practices, including deforestation, remember those trees we were talking about before, with organic agriculture. Number two, investments to dramatically raise energy efficiency standards and equally dramatically expand the supply of solar, wind, and other clean, renewable energy sources need to form the leading edge of the transition to a green economy in all regions of the world. These clean energy investments will become, in turn, major new engines of job creation throughout the world. And that's always been the argument, Green New Deal or otherwise. Number three, the green economy transition must include strong measures for a just transition for workers and communities whose well-being are currently dependent on the fossil fuel industry. This applies, of course, obviously to the same Russian examples. As noted above, the costs of these investments and just transition, and that's the most important thing, is that you have, not only investment, but you have justice as part of it. Just transition measures must be borne primarily of the rich countries and wealthy individuals who have benefited the most from the fossil fuel era. See the Cokes. It is important. We don't have time to wait for neoliberal capitalism to collapse and be replaced by socialism, as much as many people would like to have that happen. So it's a useful little reading here in quotes from Massachi, the issue of tactics, etc. Most broadly, Chomsky expresses deep respect for the achievements that the climate movement has made to date throughout the world. He's also emphatic that the movement still has time to achieve its goal. That is nothing less than saving the planet from disaster. And so this is closing with Chomsky's inimitably bracing reflections on the question. There are countries and localities where serious efforts are being undertaken to act before it's too late, and it is not too late. The answer to the mad race to produce more means of self-destruction is obvious enough, at least in words. Implementation is another matter, and there is still time to mitigate the impending climate catastrophe if a firm commitment is undertaken. That is surely not impossible if the facts can be faced. In 1941, the U.S. faced a serious, though incomparably lesser threat. i.e., fascism, and responded with a voluntary mass mobilization so overwhelming that it greatly impressed Nazi Germany's economic czar Albert Speer, who lamented that totalitarian Germany could not match the voluntary subordination to the national task in the more free societies. Yeah, that's the difference between slave labor and capitalist labor, I suppose. All righty. So that's my little deal for today. I found that Paul Koschott does really interesting speculations, and in this particular case, he compares Newtonian physics to a certain approach to thinking using Markov processes to historical materialism, which I find quite interesting. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with it, but it is interesting only because when you think that a Markov process is a philological or a linguistic process or a technique or methodology, to try to apply it to history is sort of a really interesting kind of argument. And then one that's a little even more wacky is Koschott talking about materialism, time, and infinity. It's a more recent little piece, and it may seem a little out there, but as I've said, and as I've noted with Koschot's work, he is suggesting the wave of the future from a material radical point of view. And then I included um, uh, John Ruskin's resistance to the Manchester School of Economics. The Manchester School of Economics was and I suppose that's probably why Marx never got a position at the University of Manchester, is because it's all about laissez-faire capitalism, a liberal democratic, proto-neoliberal economy. But anyway, John Ruskin talking about political economy, which I think is useful considering that he's more known for art rather than political economy. Okay, so that's all I have to say. Let's see what other commentaries others were. Anti-bads, the Green Industrial Revolution. Yes, indeed. These are interesting ideas, so worthy of our attention. So I will stop share because I've gone over time yet again, and